when you have some controls over the insurance company.
Gentleman's time
I
has
yield
expired.
back the balance of my time, and I'm appreciative of doing something worthy to be remembered.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to close on this side, so I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker, I'm pleased to yield to John Giaramondi of California the balance of our time on this side. 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the members of this House for what is an extraordinary debate, a debate of which there is a lot of false information. I was the insurance commissioner in California, and I can talk about these insurance issues forever, but what I'd really like to focus on is the fact that the law that is in the land today really helps people. It helps people like my deceased. It would help people like my deceased sister-in-law, juvenile diabetic. She spent the last 20 years of her life struggling to get insurance which she couldn't get because she had a pre-existing condition. That won't be the case in the future for those with juvenile diabetics. They'll be able to get insurance, and they'll be able to get it through an exchange in their states, at least those states that have it, at an affordable cost. And if they don't have the income, they'll have a subsidy to buy the insurance. It'll help people like the son of my chief of staff, who was born with kidney failure. He had insurance from conception to hours after he was born, but the insurance company dropped him. That won't happen anymore because children throughout this nation will be able to stay on their parents' policy because of this law. It'll help people like my daughter, who turned 21, and the insurance company, who had covered her for 21 years, dumped her. Because of this law, she is now on my policy. And there's some 17 million other young adults who have insurance as a result of this law. I could talk forever about the way in which the insurance companies discriminate based upon age, sex, pre-existing conditions. And across this nation are millions upon millions of Americans who are denied, or were denied coverage, but are no longer because of the Patient's Bill of Rights. This is insurance reform on steroids, and I wish I had this law available to me when I was insurance commissioner in California. This is a good law. This is a very, very good thing for Americans. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to close on this side, so I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas has a remaining time of 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I will yield the balance of my time to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Mrs. Bachmann, who is a member of the Financial Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee.
Gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding. If there's anything that we have learned, Mr. Speaker, over the last several years as we've debated the President's health care plan, it's that it's been a mirage, and it has been built on a series of one broken promise after another. The President told us that we would be saving $2,500 a year per household if we passed his health care bill. But the sad reality is that Americans' health insurance premiums have increased by almost that amount, which means the President was off by a stunning $5,000 per household. And Americans are pulling their pockets inside out, saying, Mr. President, I don't have the money to pay $5,000 more per year on my health insurance policy. Of course they don't, because this has proved to be the crown jewel of socialism. That's what government health care is. And senior citizens realized early on they had the most to lose by the President's health insurance policy, because what they found from this bill, which has been commonly called Obamacare, is that $575 billion will be stolen away from them out of Medicare. And not only will they have $575 billion less in Medicare, they're also looking at having to spend senior citizens out of their pocket $200 billion more in increased taxes for Medicare. That's a big loss for America's senior citizens. But it doesn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. Millions of Americans across the United States are now going to find out that the promise the President made that if you like your health insurance, you can keep it, that's a sham too. Not only will you not keep it, millions of Americans are looking at being thrown off their current health care policy that they have from their employer. Millions of Americans will no longer even have the option of their employer's health insurance plan. How do I know that? I talked to a job provider today, 400 employees. He told me he can no longer afford to provide health insurance because of all the new increased costs. He isn't the only one. I talked to another employer today, Mr. Speaker, a woman. She had 250 employees. Now she's down to 90. She told me if we can't repeal this bill, she'll have to actually let them go, and it'll be down to 50.
Gentlewoman's time
we
has
have
expired.
to repeal this bill, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, small businesses create 7 out of every 10 new jobs, and they are the driving force behind this great nation's economy. And we need these jobs as we attempt to rebound from a stubborn recession. As chairman of the Small Business Committee, I constantly hear from small business owners that the burden of government regulations and taxes is too high. The health care law is perhaps the worst offender. The last thing the federal government should do is discourage job creation. Yet this massive health care law, with all its costs and mandates and regulations and paperwork, does exactly that. Facing the expense and confusion this law creates, it's natural that small businesses decide to wait and see instead of invest and grow. And the worst impacts of this law are yet to come. We should be freeing up our small businesses to plan and grow and hire. Heavy-handed government causes both entrepreneurs to be cautious. Businesses are reduced from thinking about growth to thinking about survival. Brian Vaughn, a small businessman in Douglas, Georgia, planned to open a new store and reinvest profits. Testifying to our committee, he said, and I quote, "I fear that neither of these dreams nor my plans to achieve them will be possible. In fact, my worry is that everything I have worked for will be for naught and may be wiped out by this new health care law," unquote. Fortunately, we have a solution. Repeal this burdensome law. Stop it in its tracks before small businesses like Brian's are permanently harmed. Then pass common sense solutions. We want real reforms that put patients in charge of their health and bring down costs. This law is historic, but for all the wrong reasons. It reaches too far into the personal decisions of Americans, and it puts a heavy burden on our economy and small businesses. It's an example of big government at its absolute worst. We have a responsibility to repeal and replace this intrusive law before any more damage is done. So let's vote this big government intrusion out and give small businesses a real chance to do what they do best, and that's create jobs. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 15 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to the bill before us today. The Supreme Court's recent ruling upholding the health care bill was a historic win for this nation's small businesses and their employees. Repealing the Affordable Care Act will be an enormous step backwards for 26 million small firms who not only want relief from high health care costs, but for Congress to focus on job creation. This bill will not help a single small business secure a loan, break into new product markets, or invest in its operation. The other side acknowledges this legislation is going nowhere, just like the previous vote we took at the beginning of this Congress. Not only is the health care bill good law, it is good policy and has already led to major achievement for small companies since its enactment. The tax credits from the health care bill have saved over 300,000 small firms an average of $1,400 on their insurance costs. The Qualifying Therapeutic Discovery Project program has invested $1 billion in over 4,600 small, innovative firms that are developing groundbreaking therapies and creating jobs. Small firms are receiving more value for their premium dollars because the 80-20 rule is now in effect. Because of this, not only is the small group market receiving $321 million in rebate this summer, they are benefiting from lower premiums. The future of health reform will bring expanded coverage for preventive services and new state health exchanges in 2014, allowing more employers to purchase affordable insurance. Soon, prior medical conditions will not bar anyone from obtaining coverage. As the implementation of health care reform continues, improving the health of the nation's citizens will remain a priority for Congress going forward. At a time when economic growth is critical, we should be focusing on how to help small businesses raise capital and create jobs. Today's bill does none of this. Instead, it threatens our nation's job creators. It imposes a tax increase by eliminating critical small business tax credits, which have generated $485 million worth of savings. By doing away with reforms that establish new health insurance market, it will limit small businesses' ability to secure coverage and eliminate choices for entrepreneurs. Small businesses already pay 18% more for coverage than their corporate counterparts. The loss of new safeguards will compound this problem. Because of health reform, insurers are no longer able to raise rates arbitrarily. Passage of this bill will strip new protections that provide bargaining power to small companies. Rather than making improvements to the law, the Republicans want to eliminate it without offering any alternatives. While I agree that more can be done to make healthy living more attainable for Americans, voting for today's bill will not do that. One of the first votes I took this Congress was against Republican efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I will continue opposing any efforts repealing a law that is beneficial to millions of small firms. I urge members to oppose the bill, and I urge the leadership to focus on meaningful ways to address this nation's economic challenges. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New York reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I would yield 2 minutes to my friend, the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Mr. Micah of Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
Will the gentleman state his inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, I had not been privy to the prior debates of our discussion of subject and the repeal legislation at hand. Is it appropriate and within the decorum of the House to refer to the legislation that is being considered repeal as repealing Obamacare? I don't want to inflict any disrespect on the office of President, or should we refer to keep in the decorum and respect for the office from referring to the President's plan for health care government takeover as Obamacare or in another term? What would be appropriate under the
The chair will not render an advisory opinion.
I'm sorry?
The chair will not render an advisory opinion.
But if I do refer to it as Obamacare, I'm not out of order?
The chair will not render an advisory opinion.
Well, thank you. And I have been instructed by the staff that the proper term of the title of the bill, I guess, Mr. Speaker, is repeal of Obamacare, but I wanted to clarify that before I begin. As the Supreme Court rendered its decision, I had the opportunity to stand with some of my colleagues on the steps of the court just across from the Capitol. And I stood on the steps and spoke to the crowd gathered with other members of Congress, and I said, the decision by the court to again uphold the law that we seek to repeal, the decision was basically the decision to tax the people, and the power to tax, it's been said, is the power to destroy. I come before the House tonight and I'll state the same concerns I expressed on the steps of the Supreme Court. First, the power to destroy. It's appropriate tonight that the Small Business Committee is here and chaired by the distinguished gentleman from Missouri. American small business has been stuck in neutral, and the decision by the court in upholding this law is taking small business, which is stuck in neutral, and actually putting it in reverse. It's putting it in reverse because it is one of the largest tax impositions, call it a mandate, call it a penalty, that you can impose on small business, which is the primary economic generator in the United States. As a former businessman, I know the difficulty in trying to keep the door open, the lights on, the bills paid. And this is probably creating the greatest uncertainty and the greatest depression in the creation of jobs and expansion of small business in the United States. So indeed, the power to tax is the power to destroy. Secondly, I stand in support of the measure to appeal Obamacare, or the President's plan for health care, because of the impact on our senior citizens. The power to destroy something they sought as seniors and a promise from our government, Medicare. To cut $500 billion from Medicare is not the way to go. That's why I oppose the President's plan and ask for its repeal and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, since I have two speakers on this side, I will continue to reserve.
The gentlelady from New York reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, at this time I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Gentleman
Mr.
from
Speaker.
Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A U.S. Chamber of Commerce survey showed that 74% of small businesses contend that the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act will make job creation at their companies even more difficult. A recent report by Bloomberg News noted that the President's health care law will impose an estimated $813 billion in new taxes on job creators and middle-class families based on data from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Additionally, the law and the more than 13,000 pages of related regulation issued before July the 11th of 2012 are causing great uncertainty, slowing economic growth, and limiting hiring opportunities for the approximately 13 million Americans searching for work. Imposing higher costs on businesses will lead to lower wages, fewer workers, or both. Half of all small business income will face higher taxes, according to Bloomberg News and the analysis by the Joint Committee on Taxation, which also shows President Obama's plan for massive tax hikes would mean higher taxes on 53% of business income reported on individual returns. The Obamacare tax is already holding back job growth and medical innovation, with venture capital investment in medical device firms down over 50% in 2011 compared to any previous 5 years. Mr. Speaker, today I had 17 members of the South Florida chapter of the Association of Builders and Contractors saying that this law is going to adversely affect their businesses. Roger Dunshee of Twin V Catamarans in Fort Pierce, Florida, is considering who he will have to leave off of his insurance coverage or who he will have to completely get rid of from his business. David Carbone, President and CEO of St. Mary's Hospital in West Palm Beach, is concerned about how he will be able to run the hospital and also the type of care he will be able to provide. Dr. Mark Powers of the orthopedic specialist in Port St. Lucie, Florida, is concerned about what he will be able to provide as a small business owner. I ask for 15 seconds more, if I could.
I'd ask permission to yield the gentleman 15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, this is not about taking anything away from the American people. We can keep what is good, but this is bad policy that had to be passed in order for us to find out what was in those 2,700 pages. Let us do what is right for the American people. Repeal this onerous monstrosity that is nothing more than a tax law and develop a health care solution for which the American people can be proud. I yield back.
Gentleman's time is expired. Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
At this point, Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Peters, 3 minutes. 3 minutes to Mr. Peters.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes.
Correct.
3, is that correct? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in opposition to the Republican Affordable Care Repeal Act because it is an irresponsible approach that does nothing to address the rising cost of health care that our families and our businesses are facing today. It is a fact that the fastest rising cost for most U.S. companies is health care. Without the Affordable Care Act, overall health care costs will continue to rise even faster, costs that will be borne by both the public and private sector. It is important to note that voting for this repeal bill will eliminate the small business health care tax credit. This tax credit currently allows small businesses to offset up to 35% of their health care insurance cost. Starting in 2014, the credit will increase to 50% of premium cost. Small businesses have faced outrageous increases in their health care costs over the past decade. The Affordable Care Act helps reduce that burden and is already making a real difference in people's lives. Nearly 2 million employees at 309,000 small businesses have taken advantage of the tax credit, receiving an average credit of $1,400. This repeal bill will put a stop to this important small business tax credit. And I want to make sure that we all understand that the repeal of the Affordable Care Act will result in a tax increase on small businesses, businesses which create almost 2/3 of all new jobs in this country. Let's be clear what the Affordable Care Act does for people and for small businesses. The Affordable Care Act prohibits health plans from imposing caps on lifetime and annual coverage. It bars cancellation of insurance policies. It guarantees free preventative care that lowers the cost of health care. It eliminates denial of coverage for pre-existing conditions. And by eliminating this unfair practice, health care reform helps nearly one-third of uninsured, self-employed entrepreneurs. But critics of the Affordable Care Act claim that they want to go back to the old system, a system where small businesses pay more on average for health insurance than large companies, yet receive fewer benefits. A system that has small business premiums rising 113% over the past decade. A system where our country continues to lag behind other advanced nations in delivering timely and effective care, and a system where Americans spend twice as much as other nations on earth but have worse health outcomes. The Affordable Care Act protects the nation's 26 million small businesses from unfair premium hikes and ensures that they have predictable and stable costs. Without the Affordable Care Act, out-of-control costs will only get worse, rising to $4.4 trillion by 2018. We cannot go back to business as usual. The Supreme Court has settled the issue of the law's constitutionality, and Congress should stop these election year stunts. This bill has no chance of being signed into law. We need to stop playing political games and focus on putting Americans back to work. Instead of just saying no, Republicans need to work with Democrats to improve and implement a law that ensures health care is affordable and accessible to all Americans.
It's expired. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois and the chairman of the Small Business Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access, Mr. Walsh.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman, and to my colleague on the other side, the small business health care tax credit has proven incredibly ineffective. The GAO itself has said that it is much too complex, and like everything Washington does, its temporary nature has really done nothing to reduce the cost of health care for small business. Mr. Speaker, my state of Illinois is hurting. Real unemployment has been above 11% for the past 3 years. I've heard from employers throughout my district that they do not support the President's health care law. They do not support the more than 13,000 pages of new regulations. They're already buried under regulations. They don't support the 21 new taxes. They're already overtaxed. And they definitely do not support the increased health care costs. They've seen their health care costs rise at an unsustainable rate. Mr. Speaker, the numbers speak for themselves. 74% of small businesses say the law makes it more difficult to hire additional employees. Why don't my colleagues on the other side listen to the people who create jobs in this country? Why do my colleagues on the other side always think they have all the answers? It's time we listened. It's time we repealed Obamacare. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Missouri has 7 3/4 minutes. Gentlelady from New York has 8 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on average, small businesses pay more for health insurance than large firms for compatible policies, but receive fewer benefits. Prior to enactment of the ACA, 20% of consumers were in plans that spent more than 30 cents of every premium dollar on administrative costs, and an additional 25% were in plans that spend between 25 and 30% of every premium dollar on administrative costs. The ACA included the medical loss ratio that requires insurance companies to spend at least 80% of small employer premiums dollars on medical costs instead of administrative expenses. Is that bad for small businesses? When Republicans were in control of both chambers and held the Oval Office, they talked about this solution for nearly a decade, and yet nothing happened. In that time, small businesses saw the employees' premiums rise by an average of $700 every single year. Why should small businesses believe they can deliver on a promise this time? So finally, the law needs to be implemented. The most beneficial provision to small employers doesn't go into effect until 2014. The availability of state exchanges in 2014 could spur more small business owners to provide health benefits to employees. For example, in California, just 30%, 32% of small businesses currently offer health insurance to their employees, but the number of those likely to offer insurance through exchanges jumped to 44%. So don't repeal this legislation just for the sake of energizing the Republican base. You know that by enacting today's and taking this vote, this is going nowhere. What we should be doing, and someone on the other side said that we should be listening to small businesses. Yes, we are listening to small businesses, and what I hear from small businesses is that they are having trouble getting consumers through their doors, that they're having trouble selling their products, that they're having trouble accessing capital. Those are the obstacles that they are facing today. This and that will prevent small businesses from creating jobs. And that is what this economy needs in order to get the economy growing again. So repealing this today is not going to create one single job. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schilling.
Gentleman from Illinois has 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many in Illinois' 17th District, I'm disappointed that the Supreme Court decided to uphold the President's health care reform law. The Court ruled what we all knew from the beginning, but the President wouldn't acknowledge. The law's individual mandate is really a tax on the American people and businesses that create jobs. Under this law, the health care costs remain too high. Government bureaucrats remain between patients and their doctors. Too many Americans remain unemployed, with the national unemployment hovering above 8% for the last 41 straight months. The law's medical device tax will continue to raise health care costs and limit the ability of facilities like Cook Medical in Canton, Illinois, to expand and grow jobs. And the law's employer mandate will continue to force employers to choose between paying a penalty, increasing the number of employees eligible for health care coverage, replacing full-time staff with part-time employees, or laying folks off. Mr. Speaker, now is not the time to raise taxes on working-class families or employers. We need to repeal this law and get to work on a bipartisan health care reform that lowers costs and makes health care more convenient and more affordable. I'm new to Congress, but I have a plan to address rising health care costs while ensuring those who need it have access to coverage. I urge men and women from across America to visit shilling.house.gov to take a look. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentlelady continues to reserve. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado and the Small Business Subcommittee Chairman on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade, Mr. Tipton.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The ranking member just listed off many of the challenges that businesses face, and we agree. But let me add one more. A company in Pueblo, Colorado, PDI, employing better than 200 handicapped individuals. That company is threatening to be able to see their business shut down because of Obamacare. They simply cannot afford it. That is the challenge that small businesses across this nation are truly facing. A $2 trillion tax. A $2 trillion tax when we need to be investing that in things like competition. Let's create those opportunities, positive opportunities, through health care, allowing the marketplaces to work, ensuring that people have those opportunities to have pre-existing conditions covered. Let's let our children who are 26 years old stay on those policies, but let's bring competition to the market and have things like tort reform as well. PDI and those handicapped individuals in Pueblo, Colorado are counting on common sense, Not politics as usual out of Washington, D.C., where one size fits all and Washington has all the answers. Let's not get between that patient-doctor relationship. The people are counting on positive action. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I will continue to reserve.
Gentlelady continues to reserve. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado and Chairman of the Small Business Subcommittee on Investigations, Oversight, and Regulations, Mr. Kaufman.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court decision to uphold President Obama's health care reform law has reinforced the need for Congress to repeal and to replace this law. No doubt health care reform is important. Today, health insurance is far too expensive, and health care reform should lower costs and broaden access without compromising the quality of care. I support tax incentives to help individuals buy health insurance, high-risk insurance pools for those afflicted with pre-existing conditions, allowing small businesses to band together for the purchase of health insurance so that they can get the same discounts that large corporations receive, and medical malpractice reform to help bring health care costs under control by curbing the unnecessary and costly practice of defensive medicine. Mr. Speaker, it is time for Congress to act, to show the American people that we can accomplish meaningful health care reform without crippling the economy and bankrupting our nation. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to inquire of the Chair how much time each side has left.
Gentlelady has 5 minutes remaining.
I would like to
Gentleman
yield
from Missouri, 4 1/4.
to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, 3 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my fellow New Yorker. I rise today opposed to the 31st edition of this legislation and urge my colleagues to vote against it. Just what are we doing here today on the floor of this House? Are we passing job bills that will help the middle class? No. Are we working together to help America recover from the recession? No. Are we passing a bill that has any chance of being signed into law? No. So what exactly are we doing? Are we politically posturing during an election year? Yes. And are we voting to repeal a law that more Americans support than oppose without any hint of a plan for replacement? Yes. And are we voting to deny 6.6 million young adults health benefits under their parents' insurance? Yes. Are we voting to raise costs for some 5.3 million seniors who pay for their prescription drugs? Yes. Are we voting to deny 17 million children with pre-existing health conditions the opportunity for coverage? Yes. Are we voting to take away free screening and preventative checkups? Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, we can do better than this. Mr. Speaker, we must do better than this. The Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, a conservative-leaning court, has ruled, and the debate has ended over the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. Instead of repealing the health care bill for the 31st time in 19 straight months, in a Congress that has done absolutely nothing to create jobs, isn't it time to move on to something, anything, that will help our struggling middle class? Mr. Speaker, the American people are sick and tired of the games played on this floor. Let's end this debate and get back to work. Work that will find us passing bills that will help grow jobs, work that will find us working together to inspire a thriving middle class. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court's unfortunate decision to uphold Obamacare doesn't mean it's the right thing for this country. It's not. It was bad public policy when it was forced upon the American people 2 years ago, and it's bad public policy today. Last Friday, the Department of Labor announced that millions are still out of work across this country. Businesses are still struggling to keep their doors open. It's unfortunate that this president doesn't seem to recognize that this law is hurting American workers and those looking for work. Businesses will be hit with more than $500 billion, $500 billion in new taxes, and the Supreme Court has said what it is, a tax, in a maze of burdensome red tape and mandates that could cost a loss of 1.6 million additional jobs. We can't afford that. And for what? A law that puts government ahead of people. A law that consolidates power into the hands of a group of 15 unelected bureaucrats. A law that has already increased health care costs and will limit Americans' access to quality, affordable health care. There is a better way forward. This misguided law must be replaced with patient-centered reforms that allow families to make their own health care choices and to visit the doctor that they want to visit. Health care decisions should be made at homes, around kitchen tables, all across the country, not in back rooms on Capitol Hill. Mr. Speaker, we do not need health care reform like this, but we do need health care reform. This law is not the answer. It's a big government power grab. That's what it really is. And what history has shown time and again is that big government makes things more expensive, more bureaucratic, and less effective. It's time to repeal this law and get our economy moving again and get Americans back to work. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields his time back. Gentlelady from New York.
I continue to reserve.
Gentlelady continues to reserve. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina and chairman of the Small Business Subcommittee on Health Care and Technology, Ms. Elmers.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to speak out against Obamacare and why we must repeal it. The Supreme Court's decision last month has verified that Obamacare is one of the biggest tax increases in modern history. Furthermore, a board of 15 unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats will now remain in place to determine the health care for millions of Americans while cutting $500 billion out of Medicare for our seniors. The American people now have a clear choice, and we in Congress can either support historic tax and spending, find fiscal uncertainty and unprecedented government overreach, or join together to fight to repeal this Obamacare tax and work for real solutions while taking health care decisions out of the hands of government bureaucrats and putting them back into the control of doctors, patients, and their families. By repealing Obamacare, we will restore the doctor-patient relationship and protect our seniors from ceding this relationship to a board of unelected bureaucrats. Our system must not dictate to doctors how to provide care, force them to provide medications regardless of known complications, and then make them liable with no limits or protections. Reforming the health care system and ensuring patient-centered access to care is not a Republican idea. It is not a Democrat idea. Rather, it is the obligation of all of us to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to inquire of the chair how much time is left on each side.
Gentlelady from New York has 3 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Missouri, 30 seconds.
Okay. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson.
Gentlelady is now recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank you to the Speaker. I thank the gentlelady from New York for her distinguished commitment and service to small businesses across America. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter to the Governor of the State of Texas from Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Without objection, so ordered.
Just a few minutes ago, a colleague rose to the floor and called this socialism. It is not. Many have risen to the floor to talk about how this will impact negatively on small business. It will not. I rise enthusiastically to oppose what is a political legislative act, the repeal of the Obamacare. It is really the Affordable Care Act. And by the statement of the United States Supreme Court, of which I read, the statement that Justice Roberts indicated, beginning in 2014, Those who do not comply with the mandate must make a shared responsibility payment to the federal government. That is what this is about, sharing and bringing about health care costs that will come down, not up. And to my small businesses, let me say how much we care for you. I have supported small businesses throughout my public life and before, and I would argue vigorously that this helps to ensure that you can keep employees and add employees. In fact, between 2010 and 2011, health care costs dropped to 3.9% when it was above 6%, almost one-half less than before the Affordable Care Act was passed. This, frankly, exempts all businesses fewer than 50 employees. That means some 96% of American small businesses will not even be impacted. But for those who are, this legislation will provide $40 billion in tax credits for small businesses to offer health care. Now, in 2011, 360,000 small businesses have benefited from the health care tax credit, 2 million workers. And as well, you'll be able to ensure that rather than advertisement, your health claims or health insurance will cover 85% of your premium will be on health claims and improvement activities, not advertisement. It entails that if an insurance company pays $70 for every insurance claim and quality improvement activity, you will get rebates, $127 million in total rebates in the individual market and $1.3 billion, Mr. Speaker, to consumers and businesses. The fact is, this is the right thing to do. Support Obamacare, oppose the repeal. This is good for business. I yield back.
Who yields? Time.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close if the gentleman doesn't have any further speakers.
In that case, gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. What will small businesses lose if health care reform is repealed? Small business tax credits that save employers $435 million in 2011 will be abolished. Insurers will be able to continue price gouging their customers and denying coverage for pre-existing conditions. Repeal will mean millions of families and employers will not longer receive the benefit of lower premiums and insurance company rebates worth of over $300 million this year alone. I urge a no vote because the ACA was a step in the right direction. Without it, the self-employed and small business employees will continue to be uninsured at high rates, with no hope of Republican action to fix the broken health care system. Mr. Speaker, instead of holding this vote, we should be spending our time on targeted measures to help our nation's small businesses grow and create jobs. Maybe what we should be doing today is debating the jobs bill that the President presented to us in the House of Representatives. I yield back the balance of my time, and I urge a no vote.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to address the comments made by the speaker before, the last speaker, the gentlelady from Texas, who claimed that 4 million small businesses are going to be able to take advantage of this tax credit and how much it was going to help. We requested a GAO study and found that only 170 small businesses have even taken partial advantage of this credit. This bill is grossly ineffective. It does not work, and it hurts small businesses. And I would urge my colleagues to vote to repeal this piece of legislation and help get this economy finally rolling so we can pass some real reforms when it comes to health care. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I appreciate it.
Okay. The gentleman yields his time back. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 6079 is postponed.
I will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentlelady rise from Texas? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We have just finished part of the debate for legislation that wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I rise today as we conclude and begin to look toward the conclusion of the debate tomorrow to make a public appeal. When the 1965 Medicare law was written, it was written to save lives. We have statistics that recognize that prior to Medicare, Americans were living 60 years and under. It is well documented that we've extended the lives of senior citizens through Medicare. Now the Affordable Care Act seeks to extend the lives of the sickest of the sick, to extend the lives of children with pre-existing diseases, to extend the lives of individuals who would not have access to insurance, or those families who have been thrown into poverty because of catastrophic illnesses or an accident. We can do better. This bill is a premise of allowing and providing for all Americans to be insured. This bill cries out for Republicans and Democrats to work together. This bill cries out for saving the lives of Americans who have been falling along the highway of despair and dying.
Time has expired.
It is important for us to look for the common and better good, the public good. Save this bill. Vote against the repeal. I yield back.
Are there further requests for 1-minute remarks? Okay. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming, is recognized for 32 minutes as designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to be on the floor once again to really talk about my favorite subject in Congress, and that is health care. I am a physician, have been a physician for 36 years. I am a family physician, still have an active practice, and practice when I get a chance, which lately has not been very often. We'll be talking about Obamacare, the repeal of Obamacare. We'll be talking about Medicare. I say we, that is, if I'm joined by some of my colleagues who may be making their way here this evening. I want to just, in the way of introduction, let everyone understand, Madam Speaker, that how did we get here in the first place? Why are we here this evening talking about this? Why are we talking about the repeal of Obamacare? And I take you back to 1965 when there was a recognition that insurance was becoming, that is, health care insurance, was becoming something more than just insurance. That is to say that insurance, of course, in theory, is to protect against catastrophe. And we see that, of course, in our homeowners insurance and our car insurance. And so it seemed a good idea to have some form of insurance where you would not be bankrupted by a sudden or severe illness and have your life savings taken away. And so the idea of insurance came up, and it was mostly a catastrophic policy. And then that sort of evolved over time into more and more comprehensive concepts, and really has become today extremely comprehensive, perhaps even a health management type of system that you pay into, and hopefully the system takes care of you. And there was a recognition that a robust market did not exist for insurance for the elderly. And from that sprang the idea of Medicare, health care insurance for the elderly, which is really not insurance per se. It's really a 100% single-payer government program. And then also insurance, again, a single-payer program for the poor, and that is Medicaid. And that began around 1965, And it began with a promise to the healthcare system and to the elderly that this would never usurp the relationship with the patient, that the decisions would be made by the providers and the patients, and that Medicare, of course the government, taxpayers if you will, would be picking up the bill. No questions asked. And there was also recognition that even though patients would help with their bills, they would still have to pay something into that. But and I'll also interject that there was the belief, estimates, actuarial estimates, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, that predicted that a program that would be maybe $3 billion annually would maybe top out at $12 billion. And of course we know now that it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, many times over what it was initially promised to be. And in that evolution, we saw where government and insurance companies began to take a larger and larger role in covering for various things. For instance, beginning in the early 80s, Medicare began to see the physician charges becoming a problem, and from a budgetary standpoint, they weren't really going up that fast, but because of the growth of the elderly out there, it was running the cost up. And that led to restrictions put on what doctors could charge. Then came EMTALA, which is an acronym, a long acronym that basically says, regardless of your ability to pay, if you show up to the emergency room, the doctors in hospital have to treat you. So these are all things that began to add up over the years, and it's made Medicare, of course, balloon into an extremely expensive program, as is Medicaid as well. In fact, for most states, that is the largest budgetary item that they have. Well, fast forward to 2008, as a physician, I became very concerned that we needed health care reform in this country. Why? Because government had become such a large part of the health care system and the so-called insurance thereof, and with the price fixing that went along with that, that it began to actually have a perverse effect on health care. That is to say that as reimbursement to hospitals, doctors, and other providers were going down, that costs were actually going up just as fast, which is just the opposite you would expect intuitively. And why was that happening, and why is it happening today? Well, the answer is this. A physician, a hospital, anybody, the first thing that they're going to do, first thing a business or a factory is going to do, is when the reimbursement per unit goes down, that is, a reimbursement per patient goes down, you make it up on volume. And you keep working harder, and you keep seeing more patients, and you find more things to do to drive up that. And I'm saying this in a generic way. I do not ascribe to that, but many doctors have been put in that position to just stay solvent in their practices. They have run faster and faster, seen more and more patients, done anything they can. And so while they make an extra dime to keep up with their cost, they're running the system up by a factor of 10. They make a dime for themselves, but the system costs $1 for that. And as a result, we've had severe inflation. And so it was my belief that the way to solve this problem was to begin to move government out of health care and begin to move the private sector back in, put together robust and healthy markets, give consumers choices once again. Patients have skin in the game, that is to say that they have to pay a little something into it. Because remember, back in the 80s, patients' out-of-pocket expense, for instance in Medicare, for laboratory and many other items, went to zero, which meant that instead of having to negotiate with the patient what is the best ideas in terms of a list of tests that must be performed to get to the answer, I can just simply make out a list as long as I want. Somebody's going to pay for it, but it won't be the patient. And therefore, again, health care inflation. So I came to Washington after being elected to work on this with the other side of the aisle because I saw that we had two major giant entitlement programs that are bankrupt in this country, Medicaid and Medicare. I'll remind folks that Medicare runs out of money according to whichever actuary you want to listen to in 5 to 12 years, but they all agree it runs out of money and the services will have to be sharply curtailed. And what we found was that the other side of the aisle, our Democrat colleagues over there, decided that instead of solving the problem by bringing the marketplace, they wanted to take government another step. It reminds me of a story that was told to me once about two farmers. They were on a wagon, they had a mule, and they're going down the road, it's an old farm road, and one of the wheels breaks, and they come to a stop. Now the mule can't pull that wagon, it's just too hard to pull it on one wheel. So the two farmers get off, one starts fixing the wheel, and the other one starts going back home. And the first farmer says to the second one, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to get another mule. Because that's the way we're going to go forward. We're just going to hitch a second mule and keep dragging this wagon down the road." And you see, in my opinion, that's precisely what happened with Obamacare. Instead of fixing our health care crisis and the inflation and cost, the inefficiencies in the system and the fraud, waste, and abuse, by bringing the marketplace back into sanity and back into balance once again and letting patients be the decision makers, what we really did is double down on the government control of health care. And as a result of that, we're going to have an even more expensive, more burdensome and bureaucratic system that we won't be able to control. So anyway, this is the Doctors Caucus special order. We're going to be talking in the next 30 minutes, and we're going to be talking about the repeal of Obamacare. We have voted on this, as you've probably already heard, several times already, and of course we've never got it past the House of Representatives because the Senate won't take it up, and of course it's doubtful that the President, our current President, would ever sign it. So there are a lot of things that we hear about Obamacare. Let's talk for a moment about taxes. We just had a Supreme Court decision handed down, and there's been this debate, this battle within the Supreme Court and outside on this individual mandate where government under this bill literally forces and requires you to purchase a product or service that is created by government rather than making it more affordable and more attractive and you opting in and buying it on your own. And so the decision has been handed down that, yes, the bill is constitutional, but not by way of the Commerce Clause. But government can, Congress can now, according to the justices now, Congress can basically make you do anything Congress wants to do. It has to force you through taxes. And while we could debate whether I agree or not agree with that, that is the law of the land now. And so this means that if we in Congress decide that we want to make citizens do things, we do have a pathway now to do that, and that is to tax you. Even if you're not in an activity or buying something, we can still tax you. I prefer that we go the market route. I would much rather people buy insurance because they see a need, they see a desirability, and they see that it's cost effective rather than forcing Americans to do that. Our colleagues on the other side would rather just simply force you to do that. But now we have to also admit that this is a tax. And our friends on the other side of the aisle, I think, would admit that had this been advertised as what it turns out to be, a big tax increase on the middle class, that it would have never gotten passed because they would have been voted out of office for having raised taxes on the middle class. That's a big political no-no these days. But there are many other taxes, and I'm just going to hit on a few here. One is a 156% increase in the federal excise tax on tobacco. Another is the employer mandate. The Supreme Court says that you can, Congress, you can make employers buy insurance, or you certainly can penalize them if they don't. But interestingly enough, one part of the bill that was termed unconstitutional was coercing or forcing states to expand Medicaid eligibility. So that's a part of the Supreme Court's decision that actually is going to impact the cost of this bill. There's a surtax on investment. This is something that you're going to hear more and more about, and the way you're going to hear about it is that one day you're going to sell a home, you're going to sell a property or an investment or something like that, and the IRS is going to demand 3.8% of those profits. And on the subject of the IRS, remember that it's estimated that 16,500 new IRS agents will need to be hired and are funded in order to require or force the taxation into Obamacare. So this will certainly bring the IRS much more intimately into your life, regardless of whether you own a business or you're simply an employee or really don't even have a job. There will be an excise tax on comprehensive health insurance plans that will go up over time. Obamacare hike in the Medicare payroll tax. There will be a medicine cabinet tax, if you will, but what that really is removing the tax deductibility for the pre-tax dollars from health savings accounts that you've been able to enjoy before, that if you go and buy, say, cold medicine off the shelf, that you could buy it with your pre-tax dollars under your health savings account. That's gone. If you want to get cold medicine and use your pre-tax dollars, you have to get a prescription from a doctor. So one of two things are going to happen. Either you're going to have to see the doctor, which is going to cost you more, or the doctors are going to be spending a lot of their time, again, wasted in paperwork, writing prescriptions for non-prescription drugs. That really doesn't make much sense. There will be an Obamacare HSA withdrawal tax hike, an Obamacare flexible spending account cap, Obamacare tax on medical device manufacturing. It's estimated that many of the domestic medical device factories will simply go out of business or go offshore. The cutting-edge innovation that we have today in healthcare devices, we're going to lose that as a result of Obamacare. That will go to other countries. The itemized deductions, the exemption is going to go from 7.5% to 10% of adjusted gross income. There'll be a tax on tanning. I mean, that's got to be a middle-class tax. Obamacare elimination of tax deduction for employer-provided retirement drug coverage in coordination with Medicare Part D. Obamacare Blue Cross Blue Shield tax hike. An excise tax on charitable hospitals. A tax on innovator drug companies. A tax on health insurers. A $500,000 annual executive compensation limit for health insurance executives. Obamacare employer reporting of insurance on the W-2. The black liquor tax. The Obamacare codification of the economic substance doctrine. Again, a long list of taxes. So, you know, Madam Speaker, it seems to me that in a time that we have the worst recession since the Great Depression, we're now facing perhaps the largest tax increase that's occurred in our lifetimes, both through Obamacare and through the expiration of the Bush tax rates, which are much lower than the Clinton tax rates. And of course, you've heard some about that as well in recent days. In fact, the President himself said in 2009, the last thing in the world we want to do is to raise taxes in a recession. And everybody knows we're in 41 months of a recession and no end in sight. Now, there's also been some discussion and debate on the impact of small businesses. And I'm segueing to small businesses because, let's face it, taxes have an impact on all of our pocketbooks, but taxes also have an impact on the ability for small businesses to hire people. If you take money off their bottom line, that's less money, less capital to invest, less money to hire more people. And that is precisely what is going on with Obamacare. In fact, I would say, based on studies that I've read, one in which said that 70+% of small businesses are saying that the main reason that they're not hiring people is because of their fear, the uncertainty of Obamacare and its impact on them. And the people that I speak with throughout my district and throughout the country who say that Obamacare is probably the worst threat in the survival of their businesses, and therefore they're not going to expand their businesses. We know there's trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline right now, both small and large businesses, ready to be invested to grow jobs, and yet the job creators, the employers, are fearful. They don't want to put that money in. Why would somebody want to put, say, $10 million into a new factory, not knowing whether they can make a profit, and making the calculation that perhaps I should stand up that factory overseas someplace where, in fact, I can make a profit. I don't have to deal with Obamacare and all that comes with it. Now, that's just part of it. We also know that regulations, the hyper-regulatory atmosphere that we've evolved into, where regulations are not being written by Congress, but in people in the buildings that surround the Hill here, many of which we don't yet know. 106 new major rules being written out of this administration. The worst proliferation of regulations. So this, on top of other things, the attack, the direct hostility and attacks on energy and on job creators themselves, it's just put a complete wet blanket over our economy and the creation of jobs. And I would say that Obamacare is the lead in that entire process. Now, there's also something that I get asked about a lot, and that is, well, what about what you Republicans say about Obamacare and what the Democrats say about Obamacare? And it seems, at least it appears to them, that one of us is lying about some of these things. And, of course, one of the things that is important that we do when we come to Congress, what we understand and learn is that we should never presume ill motives of the other side. And that's exactly what I will do tonight, is not presume ill motives by the other side. So I will give you an example of what I'm talking about. We Republicans have contended all along that $500 billion will be ripped from Medicare. Again, I said earlier that Medicare runs out of money, becomes insolvent in 5 to 12 years. Everybody agrees it's in that window someplace. And we have the Ryan budget plan, which would save Medicare. The other side of the aisle refuses to engage on that. But the question is, does Obamacare take $500 billion out of Medicare? I have a lot of Medicare recipients who are very worried about that, and they ask me, because they hear and read things, they read something from PolitiFact or all these fact checkers, and they say, no, this doesn't happen, or it's not happening the way you think it does, and so forth. Well, we had a discussion with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is the prior CBO, about this 2 days ago, and he confirmed a lot of my beliefs about this. And here's the way it goes. Madam Speaker, the way laws are written, oftentimes what is in the four corners of that law says one thing, but when you add the omissions and the unintended consequences and sometimes intended consequences, the effect of that is completely different. And so, for instance, the idea that Medicare does not lose $500 billion and is dumped into Obamacare. Well, I think the nuance in there is that you have to understand that the cost of Medicare goes up progressively every year. Now, in some years it goes up higher than other years, but it always goes up. And so in Washington, oftentimes you can say that something is cut when in fact it's just the increase is reduced. And so that's really what happens here is what Democrats did in crafting Obamacare is they cut the increase in Medicare spending, and they took those so-called savings and they spent it inside of Obamacare. Well, where is it coming from? Is it going to have an impact? Well, of course it will, because as things get more expensive, if you reduce the amount of increases that nominally occur, it's going to have an impact, because there is an underlying inflationary rate that has to be recognized. So while one could make the legalistic case that no, there isn't $500 billion removed, in reality, yes, it is removed because you got to go from point A to point B, and if you don't allow that nominal increase, that inflationary rate in Medicare spending, if you don't allow that, it's a cut. It's going to be a cut in services. And where are the services? About half of it is going to be in Medicare Advantage, which is the private type of Medicare, which people really love that. It's very popular in a lot of states. And the other is going to come from providers. That would be doctors, hospitals, medical device providers, and so forth. Now, the Democrats were very careful not to take that money from beneficiaries, and in fact, in the sequestration that occurred last year and that we're still debating, where money is taken out of defense and it's also taken out of Medicare, the money is taken out on the provider side but not the beneficiary side. That is, we're not taking it away from patients, we're only taking it away from the people who are providing the care. Well, that's all well and good. Well, not so fast. You have to understand that as you reduce reimbursement of services, the ability for providers to provide those services goes down, and it's been going down progressively. Certainly a relatively small percentage of physicians today accept Medicaid for payment and reimbursement. So even if you have a Medicaid card, which, by the way, half of the so-called increase in coverage under Obamacare will be on Medicaid, well, that'll be very good. You'll have a Medicaid card, but when you shop around, you go to various doctors' offices and you say, I'd like to see the doctor today, there'll be a lot of the assistants at the desk that will say, I'm sorry, we don't accept Medicaid. Now, you might be critical of the doctor on that, but you have to understand doctors have to make payrolls, they have to pay rent like everybody else, and if it comes to a point where they can't do that, then they either have to stop seeing Medicaid patients or they have to go out of business. Either way, you're not getting in to see them because the reimbursement's not there. Well, the same phenomenon is now happening across America in Medicare. If you're on Medicare, if you're 65 and over or disabled and you're on Medicare, there has been such a flattening and ratcheting down in many cases of reimbursement that just because you have a Medicare card does not mean you're going to be seeing doctors when you want to see them. And in fact, that's precisely what I was talking about in the beginning of the discussion, is that if we just simply take the same entitlement programs that are making the cost problems worse and through a price-fixing mechanism actually perversely incentivizing waste, fraud, waste, and abuse, if we're doing that now and then we expand yet another entitlement system, we're only going to aggravate the same problem. So what's going to be the net result? We're going to have more people, more patients searching out care from fewer and fewer providers. And what will that lead to? It'll lead to long lines, and it'll lead to rationing as a natural thing, not a planned kind of rationing. That just will be the imbalance that we're going to have in the system. Now, how do I know that's going to happen? Well, as I mentioned, it's already happening, but it's not showing up to the level that you might expect just yet. But let's look at Massachusetts. Remember, Massachusetts and also Tennessee have comprehensive state programs, and since the comprehensive plan started in Massachusetts a few years ago, the waiting lines for doctors have grown now to an average of 6 weeks. Over 50% of primary care doctors are not accepting new patients. The reimbursements have gone down, and so are the number of doctors. The waiting lines are getting longer. The same happens in other countries that have single-payer systems, such as Canada and Great Britain. And as a result, how do these people get care? They go to the emergency room. And where is the most expensive care? In the emergency room. So you see, Madam Speaker, when you have a highly structured, bureaucratic, top-to-bottom system that micromanages behavior of individuals and providers, all you're going to get is higher cost, and ultimately the only way you're going to control cost is through long lines and rationing. Now, in Obamacare, Democrats did something very clever. They didn't want to depend on Congress to make those tough decisions to cut reimbursements. So they created something called IPAB, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which will be 15 unelected bureaucrats, not necessarily health care providers, appointed by the President. And again, they're unelected, and they will not be answering your phone when you call to complain. They will literally have more power than Congress itself in order to cut the benefits that you'll receive. They'll do it by way of reducing the types of services, the quality of services, and the payment for those services. It'll happen in a lot of different ways, and it'll begin to show up in delays, in more paperwork, misdiagnoses, and ultimately some very unfortunate outcomes that I can see coming down the road. Now, Congress will have the responsibility of meeting certain targets of spending. But if they fail to meet those targets, and Congress has never reached those targets, that is to cut spending by so much in Medicare, then it falls back, it defaults to IPAB, and IPAB will be the ones making those decisions. So call it what you will. There will be members of government, people who are on a governmental payroll, who will be making decisions about what services you will have. Now, a lot has been said today about all the free services that you're going to receive. Free pap smears, free breast exams, free preventive health services. Madam Speaker, I've never seen anything free in this society. Somebody is going to pay for that service. Somebody has got to pay somebody for doing it. Somebody's got to pay the secretary, somebody's got to pay the provider, somebody has got to pay the rent. Nothing in this society is free. And I will tell you that any time somebody tells you something is free in Obamacare or any other kind of health care insurance, they're just not being straight with you. Let's just be honest. Somebody is going to pay for it at one point or another. Let's talk about the social conscience part of Obamacare, which has a lot of us who are in the pro-life community very concerned. Remember, the President said that he would preserve conscience rights, that is, that providers would not be forced to provide abortions or abortifacients, that is, pills that will create abortions, or anything that's against our conscience. And in fact, the first version of Obamacare that passed the House passed only because the pro-life members of the Democrats said those protections have to be in there, the so-called Hyde Amendment that says that no taxpayer dollars will be spent on abortions or abortion-like activities. However, when it came back from the Senate, another trick was pulled, and that was that was pulled out of the legislation, but the President said, well, look, I'll write an executive order, which really has very little meaning, certainly in the long term. Any president can rescind that. There are many different ways to end run an executive order if it's not something that's in statute. And so as a result, there's plenty of holes in Obamacare, like Swiss cheese, that allow taxpayer funding of abortions. Now for the first time in many years, a majority of Americans are pro-life. But I can tell you an overwhelming majority today and always has been against the taxpayer funding of abortions. But what we're dealing with today is not the taxpayer funding of abortions. That's already in law, and that's part of the reason to repeal it. But the fact that the President is now forcing religious institutions such as the Catholic Church to provide certain services that are against their conscience, such as abortifacients, abortions, sterilizations. And so their choice is either to get out of health care entirely or to go along with the government and run into heavy fines. So where are we today with Obamacare? Is it going to be repealed? Tomorrow, Obamacare will be repealed in the House of Representatives. That you can bet on. However, we all understand that there is a problem with the Senate, which is controlled by the very people who voted it in to begin with, and a President who, though he supports it and would not sign a repeal, says very little in defense of Obamacare. But why? Because there's very little that's desirable to defend in it. So I look forward to another opportunity to vote for the full repeal, and look forward to next year when we'll have the ability to repeal
The gentleman's time has expired.
lock, stock, and barrel, pull it out by its roots, and start over again with step-by-step reform in health care with patient choices as it should be. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.